Welcome, and as we always do, or try to consistently, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
That I'm where I need to be, so I can share the screen with you. And we are, let me see if I can do this. There we are. So we're on to a new verse in Genesis, still on chapter 1. There's just so much. And of course, we were just really scratching the surface, regardless, on all the comments and thoughts that are involved in these verses and in general. So, ויברך אותם Elohim, God blessed them, ויאמר להם, and he said to them, Elohim, God said to them, Pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, umil'u et haaretz v'chivshuha, and fill the earth and subdue it, urdu bidigat hayam, and rule over the fish of the sea, uva'of hashamayim, and the birds of the skies, uva'chol chaya haramiset, and all the animals that swarm over the earth. So let's see what we can do here. V'chivshuha. Now notice how it's spelled, right? Ha'ish mitzuveh al priya v'rivya v'lo ha'isha. So you might find this, if you're not aware of this element of halacha, interesting, right? And that is that the man is commanded regarding procreation, v'lo ha'isha, but not the woman. The woman is not commanded to procreate. The Amar Kra, because scripture states v'kivshuha, and subdue her. And it says uvekivsha kativ, right? And it says, and without the uha, right? It just, and subdue her without that idea. Umidacho lichvosh, okay, and who has the natural inclination to conquer or to suppress or subdue. It turns out that men have that inclination to control, right? That is not just to control, but to subdue. And it's not in the nature of a woman to subdue in that sense, to conquer, to suppress. I realize that, again, I guess I do need to say, as I said in a previous class, we have to try to understand the culture in which these things are being said, and if possible, to adjust them and adapt them. At any rate, so we are going to be saying things that I'm sure are not going to sit well, but nevertheless, for the sake of transparency and honesty, to be able to come with these things and to look at them and decide how we want to process them, but not to chuck out everything, because there are things like this that may not sit well with us. So here we go. Piresh Ra'av. This is Ovadia Bar Knora. He is the classic commentator of the Mishnah, just as Rashi is the classic commentator of the Torah and also of the Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud. Ovadia Bar Knora is the classic commentator of the Mishnah. Pretty much every edition of the Mishnah, classic edition of the Mishnah, is going to have his commentary on it. The Mishnah Khan, in the Mishnah here. So let's see, let's just find the place in the Mishnah, what he's referring to. Oh, okay, sorry. Guess it's in here. Let's find the place. I didn't catch it. Oh, there we are. Okay. So it's in Yevamot, the tractate Yevamot. This is actually a reference to the Gemara page, right? Samachay, that's 65b. So that's what he says. Let's see here. We haven't said what he said yet. Okay. Ha'ish darko lichvosh et ha'isha. He goes further, right? Notice, please, that here it just simply says it is the inclination, of a male to suppress, etc. But it doesn't say, it just says lichvosh. It doesn't say to suppress or to subdue the wife. We're going to have to clarify this, but at any rate, he says, right, that it is to subdue his wife, the woman. And it appears that he is actually alluding to what is written the Midrash Rabbah, in the Midrash Rabbah, Parsha Zo, that is on Midrash Rabbah, of course, is not halacha per se, it is rather agadah. So I think that, trying to think, sometimes it's translated as theology, right, as opposed to law per se, right? So in this parsha of Bereshit, it says Ha'ish kovesh et ishto, that the sense that the man subdues his wife shalot tzetze lashuk, that she shouldn't go out and be a gadabout, that she shouldn't deal too much with other, in other words, go out and possibly consort with other men. That's basically the point here. It is considered, at least classically, that for a Jewish woman to act in a very modest way. And I'm not saying there aren't ways to interpret that in a way that we could find acceptable, but at any rate, if you think about some of the Middle Eastern cultures, etc., you realize that that is part of that culture. I would say that in general, and as you'll see, if we get through all of this, that basically the idea of of engaging in sexual relations in a very casual way is very counter that culture. It's not considered to be appropriate in a very severe kind of way, which is, of course, not the way our culture handles these things.
Is
Yeah, go
there
ahead.
any traditional culture in which it is appropriate?
I'm frankly not aware of it. I mean, I could, go into it a little bit in terms of what I think the rationale is. I think a lot has to do with children and making sure that children know who their parents, their actual parents are. There may be health issues that are involved. They also, I think, the best way I have of looking at it is saying that the ability to procreate is such a gift. I mean, it is a sense immortality in this particular life of ours, and to treat it respectfully, to show respect in this kind of way, is a very deep kind of thought. So that's despite where the 60s took us. And we also know that, of course, there would not be a commandment not to commit adultery if it weren't something that people were doing. At any
And
rate,
of course,
go
though,
ahead.
men back then could have various wives and could kind of do what they want, even though there might be legal consequences to some of their actions, more so than women could. So
True,
the act of respecting the monogamy of a relationship was really just for women.
correct, correct. And again, I mean, I wouldn't want to spend our entire class discussing the pros and cons of that. I'm not saying that it isn't something that requires some very deep thought. Let me say this, though, Lauren, to what you said. I think it's very interesting that in general, it seems to me that here we have, for example, Jacob, who had, quote, 4 wives. If in fact Laban had not cheated him, and if in fact Jacob had married Rachel, how many wives would he have had?
Maybe
Would have-
two.
Maybe only because Rachel wasn't capable of conceiving. But
Well,
again,
and because of
uh,
Rachel's handmaid, I
yeah, but
mean,
that was only
one
because
and
but that was because she couldn't conceive. If you read the context there, she gives him Bilhah in order to have a child. That's the only reason he has her.
so I mean, I can understand maybe then why he needed more than one, but I
Yeah.
can't doesn't translate to needing 4.
No, I'm just saying that, well, what happened is he wound up with 2 because Laban cheated him to begin with.
Yes, the one he was
And
given, the
yeah,
one he loved,
right.
who could have given him children,
She
but
wasn't
because
able
that
to.
would have also increased the jealousy, They would need the one handmaid, that's 3.
What happened was when in fact, and again, this is actually explicitly stated in the text, that when in fact, what happened was Leah stopped procreating, and when Rachel gave Jacob Bilhah in order to have a child, Leah then gave him Zilpah. So again, all I'm really trying to say is that had Jacob been able to write the playbook, he would have wound up with one wife. That's it. He would have had her, he would have children through her, etc. It didn't work out that way. And the real point I'm trying to make is in general, and you'll find it elsewhere, for example, with regards to kings, they're not supposed to multiply wives. The idea of having lots of women is not a particularly Jewish value.
Except for David.
Yes, yes,
And Solomon.
and David got into trouble over that, didn't he?
And Solomon.
Solomon got into deep trouble over it. In fact, basically, he is deeply criticized for that. That they basically turned him away from because of some of the political marriages he had. Basically, turned him away from sincere worship of God. That's something about the Bible that is actually pretty amazing. Is that even our heroes are not without their flaws. At any rate, let me thank you. No, I appreciate, any comments you have about this. Going on. Aval lule de mistafina. And he's saying it's in a way of saying he wants to respectfully disagree, right? He says, despite the fact that he has great respect for Ovadia Bertanora, which he does. There's no question that Ovadia Bertanora, as the doyen of Mishnaic commentators and explainers, deserves deep respect. He says, despite that fact, Yesh Lomar, one could say, Pashut, clearly, Daka'e al kibush haaretz, that frankly, when it talks about kivshuha, right, and overcome it or subdue it, it's referring to the land. It doesn't say the woman, okay? But milchama, for example, when it talks about men are the ones who went into battle. They're the ones who did that. And he says not only that, he has some support in the Talmud itself. The very first, it's the first page of Kiddushin on the B side of the page. It is the way of man regarding war, and it is not the way of woman. It's not a feminine quality to be engaged in battle. And according to this explanation, that the intent of that, the original comment that we just read, right, up above the line, right, me'inyan lashon zeh hakatuv, that it has to do, it's got to do with the continuation where it says, umilu et haaretz, fill the earth, v'kivshuha, right, and control it, learn how to control it. The acharei de kivsha, right, ketiv, that since it says the kivsha, right, ketiv, it writes, mashma, that it really means the rak alav haya tzivui, okay, because it says in the singular, subdue it, and not in the plural. That it's on him is the commandment, shel kvishat haaretz, not only that over the subduing of the land, shvisha hi al yedei haribui, and the overcoming it, right? The controlling it, the subduing it, is by means of multiplying, having a lot of people. That's what is meant here. Velo al isha. It's not over the woman. It's not saying that men need to subdue their women, and automatically, right? Turahi, and that's why she is exempt mi hishtadlut liharbot anashim, from having to, from the requirement or the attempt to multiply people, to have lots and lots of people. So he's really given us a whole new understanding of the Hebrew itself, and the fact that it's not giving carte blanche to men to control or subdue their women, except possibly in that one sense that a man will tell his wife, I don't want you going out and, consorting with other men especially. And for this reason, therefore, this commandment, v'kivshuha, hatachlit latzivui hakadum, and that the reason for subduing it, its intent has to do with fulfilling the previous mitzvah, urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Aval lefi harav, but according to Bertanora, lo nitpaer, it doesn't become clear. Ech nismacha drasha zu al zeh pasuk. Then the connection between that previous statement of being fruitful and multiply doesn't seem to have any connection with kivshuha, with subdue her. Subdue her, referring to the land. Okay, so that's one element, and of course now you understand why he's saying, with all due respect. And so it becomes clear to me, lefi pirushenu, according to our current explanation, ma shetarchu rabim, the extent to which so many people struggled, lekaven tam hadavar, right? Shemishuneh, to explain the reason, okay, Shemishuneh mitzvat priya verivya, that there is a distinction, right? There's a difference between the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, misha'arei mitzvot, from the rest of the mitzvahs, shechiyuvan yudchal miben yud gimel shana, because that the obligation to perform mitzvahs starts at what age? It starts at 13. But at Priya V'Riva, being fruitful and multiply, doesn't start at 13, right? V'rak mitzvat Priya V'Rivya, and only the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, imi ben esrim. It falls on one when one is 20 years old. Ukemoshe katav harambam, just as Maimonides wrote, the Perek Tetvav in chapter 15, halacha bet. These chapters are divided into specific halachot and specific laws. Me'ishut. He has a section of his Mishnah Torah called Ishut, and that has to do with matrimony. Ki afshe amru ben yudchet lachapa, that despite the fact that they say at 18 one should get married, it's only referring to the appropriate age in which to get married. But to transgress a positive commandment, at that point, if you are not starting to procreate at the age of 20, that's when you are violating the positive commandment. And by the way, this is helpful in a way to understand the relationship to the commandments and the degree to which, when we say it's a good deed, it just really lessens and degrades the full force of the idea of the mitzvot in terms of how the Torah presents them and how Judaism wants us to understand these things as our obligation. This is something that we, in a sense, owe God. And that's why we use the term chiyuv, which means an obligation or an owing of something. And that becoming a bar mitzvah is actually a very serious moment. And it isn't just about, showing one's competency or having a party or whatever. The idea is now one becomes a responsible person in terms of one's relationship to one's creator, and to do these specific acts that show that relationship and the level of appreciation for being alive and what being alive means and goes into the very idea of what it is to be a human being. I mean, there are all these kinds of implications to it. At any rate, Ulefi hatam shemevu'ar bazeh, and according to the reasoning, the rationale that has been clarified regarding this, dechiyuv priya v'rivya talui b'mi shedarcho lichbosh, that if we're saying that the obligation of being fruitful and multiply depends on the one whose way it is to subdue, b'milchama, regarding war, right? V'davar yaduahu, it's well known, shechiyuv latzet latzava, that the age of going into the army, humi ben isrim shana v'mala, it is actually 20 years old and upwards. So he has connected these dots so well, right? Because we know, if you're familiar with, for example, Ki Tisa, the Parsha of Ki Tisa, it says the census, right, was 20 males 20 years old and up. And the whole point of that census is that at that point, they thought they were about ready to enter the land. They were going to they'd gotten the Torah, they'd set up the camp, etc. They're ready to go in to conquer the land and appropriate the land of Canaan. And it talks about the census being 20 years old and up. And now those dots are totally connected, because when it says Yivshua and it was saying that it's a male thing, well, now we understand. And that's stated explicitly that it's 20 years old and up, that one enters the army, that a man enters the army. So now, even though people had difficulty in explaining why the commandment of being fruitful and multiply only applies at 20, well, now we know. Now it's clarified, and it's consistent. There are a posek is essentially a halachic decider, one who writes about halakha, Jewish law, shekatvu, that wrote, that even though a woman is not obligated in the commandment of being fruitful and multiply, nevertheless, chayevet b'mitzvat lo tohu bar'a lashevet yitzara. She still would be obligated with the commandment of, he did not create it, God didn't create the earth to be void, right? Lashevet, but to have people live in it, right? To be occupied. And that's from Isaiah. And that a woman would be, so that there's some sense of a need to make sure that the land is inhabited, that God created the earth for it to be inhabited, not for it to be just void. Vehi mitzvah derabanan, and these poskim say it is a rabbinic mitzvah. It's not a biblical commandment, but it is a derabanan. It is a rabbinic commandment of the sages. And he says, he gives you the references. Iyen be'even ha'ezer. So he's saying, look at the section of the Shulchan Aruch called Even Ha'ezer, which has to do with laws of matrimony, for example, right? And he says, Siman Aleph. In fact, the very first part of Even Ha'ezer that deals with this. V'zeh yatsa lahem, and they derive this, mishum dechashvu mitzvat priya v'rivya, because I think this is either they calculated, or they figured, or they thought of the commandment of priya v'rivya, being fruitful and multiply, umitzvat lashevet yitzara, and the commandment to occupy that God created the world in order for it to be inhabited. Lishtei mitzvot, they counted those as two separate mitzvahs. Aval lo yadati, he says, I have no idea, mehechi teta lo markan, where on earth did they get such a concept that they're two separate mitzvahs? Ki bevadai pashut hadavar, because it seems obvious. That verse that says he created it, he formed it in order to be inhabited. It's just an explanation, the ta'am, and giving a reason, a rationale, the mitzvat priya v'rivya, for the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, because God wanted the world to be inhabited. So it's simply a rationale. That's all. V'imkain, and if this is the case, bepatur. Okay, ikar hamitzvah, ipol gan hatam, or biftor ikar mitzvah. And so if we're saying that the biblical mitzvah, right, the essential mitzvah, no longer falls on a woman, that she's exempt from it, ipol gan hatam. So then the rationale for the mitzvah also, she's not responsible for that now. Uve'emet harambam, and in actual fact, the Rambam, the Maimonides, lo matz berambam in Maimonides, lo matzati kol remez lemitzvat lashevet yitzra. He says, I don't find any allusion whatsoever. There's no reference whatsoever that a woman is obligated for this rabbinic mitzvah of lashevet yitzra. This doesn't exist as far as the Rambam is concerned. It doesn't exist. When you ask Sivarale, and it would appear that he reasons that ishap Torah mitzvat priya v'yirivya, right? That when we're saying that a woman is exempt from the commandment of being fruitful and multiply, of procreation, patur muchlat, it is an absolute. It is a total. She's absolved from it 100%. Not just biblically, but rabbinically as well. And we know there are many commandments where one may not be obligated biblically, but one is obligated rabbinically, not in this case. Sheken katav beperek kaf aleph, because the Rambam wrote in chapter 21, halacha kaf vav, paragraph 26, the isurei bia. This is where this isurei bia means the prohibition against what it is basically fornication. Or Reshut Isha, he writes there, it is permitted for a woman, shelo tinaseh leolam, that if she doesn't want to ever get married, she does not have to get married, or tinaseh lesaris, or if she wants to marry a man who is incapable, a saris basically is someone who is incapable of procreation, castrated. If she wants to marry a person who's castrated, a man who's castrated, she's welcome to do it. She has full permission to do it. And the truth is, if in fact there was nevertheless some rabbinic obligation, lo haya sotem hadvarim, right? It would have been a contradiction essentially, right? And there are further proofs, but in other places in his composition of the Mishneh Torah. So, Ve'emet shematzati baran, and he says that actual fact I found in the Ran, and I took a moment to look up the Ran. He's Rabbi Nisim of Gerona. Okay, and these are just some things that I pulled out of Wikipedia, right? Great Spanish, here he is, right? He is also a major player in the Gemara, in the Babylonian Talmud, and in good editions of the Babylonian Talmud, you will find him at the back there, and he is again one of the great commentators and interpreters of the Talmud, right? So he says, I found in the Ram, Reish Perik Bet, at the beginning of chapter 2, the Kiddushin, tractate Kiddushin, Svara Chiyuvit Lanashim Kazeh, right? A compelling reason for women regarding this, Shekatav, which he wrote, V'zeh Leshono. He says, I'm going to quote him. This is from the Ran. Afalpi, despite the fact, She'ein ha'isha mitzuva bepiria berivia, that despite the fact that a woman is not commanded to procreate, michol makom, nevertheless, yesh la mitzvah mipnei, there is some sense of obligation. And mitzvah here can be translated as a good deed here, right? Mipnei, why? Shehi misayat leva'ala lekayem mitzvato, because she's involved in helping her husband to fulfill his commandment. His commandment. End of quote. Very clear. It's his commandment. For Afka Matzati, and I also found, this is of course Torah Temimah talking, right? I also found Ktsat Smuchim L'Svarazo, again, some support for this reasoning. The Tosafot, in the Tosafot, Rosh Hashanah, tractate Rosh Hashanah, 6b. Look, by the way, at how encyclopedic his knowledge is of this material. I mean, it just spans huge tracts, right? The afalpi, that despite the fact she'isha la'atzma petura, that she herself is exempt, misimchat Yom Tov, and here we're talking about the rejoicing of the Yom Tov, of making sure that a Yom Tov is a happy, rejoicing time. Mishum dehave mitzvah aseh shazman gamarma. And in case you're wondering, why would a woman not be obligated? Why should she be exempt? And it happens to fall under one of those positive, time-bound commandments. Remember, women are not obligated to perform time-bound positive commandments. And basically, the basic rationale has to do because of her responsibilities in the family and in the house. And that when you have a crying child or a child that needs help, etc., it's not fair to let the child continue to cry because you have a divine obligation, right? Michol makom, nevertheless, chayevet, she nevertheless has some obligation, bishvil ba'ala, for the sake of her husband, she'iev shalo, because it's impossible for him, lismoch bil adeha, without her, right? The need for it to be a team, right? A team obligation in some senses. V'chein katav, and for this reason he wrote, me'ein svara kazo, a similar kind of rationale. Let's see, I'm just going to see. Okay, the Sefer Charidim. This is referring to a Sefer Charidim. I'm sorry, I think I wrote down elsewhere who the author of the Sefer Charidim was. The Mechuyavim Yisraelim, that Israelites are obligated. Lishmoa Birkat Kohanim, right? That the reason why Israelites, not just women or men or whatever, but Israelites are obligated to listen and pay attention to the priestly benediction, kedei sheyuchlu hakohanim, so that the priests are able l'kayem mitzvatam, to in fact observe, right, to fulfill their mitzvah, right? They are commanded to bless the Jewish people. But in order for them to successfully do that, the Jewish people have to be assembled and listen to that blessing. Ach afilu im kain hu, right? And he says, but despite the fact that even if this is the case, ein ze ela lemitzvah ba'alma. So here he's using the term mitzvah. He says, despite all of this, it is simply a good practice. It doesn't have the force of halacha, right? It's a nice thing to do. It's a decent thing to do. V'gam rak lazo shehi tachat ba'ala, and only in the fact that she is under his protection. She's under her husband's protection and jurisdiction. V'gam bichlal svara mechudeshet hi, right? And I think what he's saying here is that it's a general, right, that we would say this thing, mechudeshet, chadash means, right, a new idea, right? It's in general, this is a chidush. It is a new kind of idea added to what was previously in the Torah, etc. It's a new kind of thought. Uladati, and according to, in my opinion, he says, lo shmiya le laharamban, right? That the Rambam doesn't necessarily, it's not something that he is considering, right? Acharei, why? Ki ein la makor b'Gemara, simply because there's no basis of these particular statements, right, in the Gemara, in the Talmud. Uvechein, and for this reason, lefi hamavuar, what has been explained up to this point, ein svara yesodit, there is no essential rationale, lechiyuv isha, to obligate a woman, b'mitzvat l'shevet yitzara, for this commandment of that he created the world, right? That Isaiah quote, that he created the world to inhabit, to be inhabited. But he's got, I mean, this is something he wants to deal with, right? V'hinei katav hamagen Avraham, and he says the Magen Avraham is one of they're called Nosei Kelim, the arms bearers of the Shulchan Aruch. In other words, he's someone also who takes the words of the Shulchan Aruch and analyzes them and applies them in terms of practical halachot, right? Halakha. But Siman Kuf Nun Gimel, he gives you the specific reference, right? In section 153, Seif Katan, subparagraph Tet 9, Bechor Shor, another major commentator player when it comes to halacha, the Ibn Ha'ezer in that second part of the Shulchan Aruch, Ibn Ha'ezer, Siman Aleph, he says Siman Aleph, I'm translated as chapter 1, Seif Katan Bit, subparagraph 2, Daha de Kaimalan, that we have we accept Mochrin Sefer Torah, or that we have on record that one is able to sell a Sefer Torah, lahasi yatomim, in order to be able for orphans to marry, right, to be able to pay their dowry or something like that, but so that orphans can marry. Hu hadin yitamot, and he goes on to say, all the more so when it comes to orphans who are women, girl orphans. Mishum, why? Degam ha'isha mechayevet b'mitzvat lashevet yitzara. So we're back, we're still dealing with this, right? And he says that the rationale for that is because a woman is obligated regarding the commandment of he created it to be inhabited, that's end of quote. So, v'hine, and in fact, lefi mashe katavnu, according to what we ourselves have written, that there is no basis to obligate women in this commandment. If that is the case, yitkayem hadin, we're going to have to say that the law is such, the hakadum, this early law, this previous law about selling the Sefer Torah, the ein mochrin Sefer Torah, that one does not sell a Sefer Torah, rak bishvil nisu'ei yetomim zacharim, but only one only sells a Sefer Torah in order to marry, in other words, for male orphans to be able to get married. But that's not the end of it, right? This is not a simple, right? By this time, I think you're convinced that this is not a simple matter. Afim calls it.
Rabbi, it's very late.
Oh, God. Sorry. Okay. Well, we can stop here. Although we will not be picking this up until next week. All right. I think. Thank you. All right. I needed a time check. Put it in here.
Sorry,
Not a lot more to go, by the way. We've only got a little bit more to go down to here, but we'll take care of it another time. I'll stop the share. Okay. And I'll stop the recording.